That Part 1, Arrival at St. Mary's. From the series, The Nuns Who Disappeared from St. Mary's, a Convent of Horrors. They arrived under the shadow of a dying sky. It was late autumn in 1854 when the first group of young women disembarked from the creaking stagecoach that had groaned its way across the muddy trails of rural Wisconsin. The surrounding forest hissed with wind and the scent of wet pine. Above them, crows circled in slow, silent spirals, watching. The women, clad in simple wool cloaks and gripping prayer books with trembling fingers, stood before the massive limestone facade of St. Mary's Convent, a towering structure of gray stone, ivy-strangled windows, and a bell tower that hadn't rung in years. No one greeted them. For several minutes, the new arrivals, 7 in total, waited at the bottom of the broad stone steps, their breath curling in the cold. One of them, a girl named Eleanor Whitcomb, just 17 and recently orphaned, clutched a small wooden cross so tightly the edge pierced her palm. She would later write in a hidden diary that her first thought upon seeing the convent was not of comfort or peace, but of death. "It looked like a tomb," she scribbled, "as if it had swallowed joy and light long ago and now waited to do the same to us." Eventually, the doors opened, not with welcome, but with warning. A tall woman appeared, draped in thick black habit and veil, her face pale and angular, her eyes dark hollows beneath the fabric. She introduced herself simply as Mother Innocenta, though no church records ever confirmed that name. She did not smile. She did not offer blessing. She only turned and gestured for the girls to follow. And so they entered, their boots echoing on stone, their prayers soft on their lips, into the convent that would soon be their prison. The entrance hall was dim, lit only by 2 wall-mounted oil lamps that flickered as though unsure whether to stay alive. Dust coated the air like fine ash. Along the walls, framed portraits of past Mother Superiors stared down with cracked, faded eyes, some faces smeared by time, others by something that looked eerily like burned soot. Eleanor caught a glimpse of one portrait with its face entirely scratched out, long gouges running from the canvas into the wood panel beneath. Their rooms were small and austere. Bare stone floors, narrow cots with horsehair mattresses, and crucifixes nailed unevenly above the door frames. The windows were small slits, barely large enough for moonlight to enter. The young women, now to be called sisters in training, were instructed to remain silent unless spoken to rise each morning at 5 for prayer, and to never, under any circumstances, wander the north wing. No reason was given, just a warning wrapped in scripture. For there are places where even angels fear to tread. The first week passed in unease. The convent's routines were strict and cold, morning prayers in the unheated chapel, labor in the laundry and kitchens, afternoon scripture studies often recited aloud in Latin, even though many of the girls barely understood English. The meals were plain, watery broth, stale bread, bitter tea, and always eaten in silence under the watchful gaze of Mother Innocenta and 2 older nuns, Sister Agnes and Sister Miriam, whose expressions never changed, whose footsteps never made sound. At night, strange noises seeped through the convent walls, moaning, whispers, the rustle of heavy fabric dragging along stone floors. The girls dismissed it at first as old pipes or the creaks of settling stone. But Eleanor wasn't convinced. One night, she awoke to find her blankets soaked in cold water. Another time, she heard chanting coming from behind her wall, low and rhythmic like a dirge, in a language she couldn't place. She pressed her ear to the cold stone and whispered a prayer. The chanting stopped. It wasn't long before the dreams began. Each of the new sisters suffered from them, though none dared speak of it aloud until much later. Nightmares of blood dripping from the eyes of the Virgin Mary, of dark tunnels filled with weeping women, of a faceless nun whose mouth stretched wide open and screamed without sound. One girl, Sister Rachel, awoke clawing at her own face, shrieking that something had crawled inside her during the night. She was taken to the infirmary and not seen again. The next day, the sisters were told she had been sent to a distant convent in Missouri. It was the first disappearance. It would not be the last. As the days passed, the girls began to notice other oddities. The clocks in the convent never worked. They all froze at exactly 30:33 a.m. The chapel candles, no matter how many times lit, would always extinguish themselves at midnight. and the large wooden crucifix that hung above the altar, said to contain a sliver of Christ's original cross, was always damp, as if crying. One night, Eleanor, restless and shivering, crept out of bed and made her way down to the chapel, hoping for a moment of peace. The halls were darker than usual, the oil lamps extinguished, and an icy draft pressed against her skin like a hand. As she reached the chapel, she heard something that froze her blood. Sobbing. A woman sobbing, muffled and desperate, coming from behind the altar. Eleanor stepped forward, whispering hello, but the sound stopped instantly, as if whoever had been there knew they had been heard. Then a new sound emerged. A wet, rasping breath, followed by the gentle tap of footsteps, coming closer. Eleanor fled. She told no one. She would write about the incident only once, burying the entry deep in the center of her Bible. It wasn't human, she wrote. Whatever was in that chapel, it wore skin like a mask, but it wasn't one of us. By the second month, another girl, Sister Madeline, was gone. This time, they were told she had become too ill to continue service and had been sent back to her family. But Eleanor had overheard something. Two older nuns whispering by the laundry basin, one saying they found her by the north wing stairs, eyes open, lips black. The other made the sign of the cross and replied, "She saw the door." That's all it takes. The girls began to feel watched, not by the Mother Superior or even the silent Sister Abt under the shadow of a dying sky. It was late autumn in 1854 when the first group of young women disembarked from the creaking stagecoach that had groaned its way across the muddy trails of rural Wisconsin. The surrounding forest hissed with wind and the scent of wet pine. Above them, crows circled in slow, silent spirals, watching. The women, clad in simple wool cloaks and gripping prayer books with trembling fingers, stood before the massive limestone facade of St. Mary's Convent, a towering structure of gray stone, ivy-strangled windows, and a bell tower that hadn't rung in years. No one greeted them. For several minutes, the new arrivals, 7 in total, waited at the bottom of the broad stone steps, their breath curling in the cold. One of them, a girl named Eleanor Whitcomb, just 17 and recently orphaned, clutched a small wooden cross so tightly the edge pierced her palm. She would later write in a hidden diary that her first thought upon seeing the convent was not of comfort or peace, but of death. "It looked like a tomb," she scribbled, "as if it had swallowed joy and light long ago and now waited to do the same to us." Eventually, the doors opened, not with welcome, but with warning. A tall woman appeared, draped in thick black habit and veil, her face pale and angular, her eyes dark hollows beneath the fabric. She introduced herself simply as Mother Innocenta, though no church records ever confirmed that name. She did not smile. She did not offer blessing. She only turned and gestured for the girls to follow. And so they entered, their boots echoing on stone, their prayers soft on their lips, into the convent that would soon be their prison. The entrance hall was dim, lit only by 2 wall-mounted oil lamps that flickered as though unsure whether to stay alive. Dust coated the air like fine ash. Along the walls, framed portraits of past Mother Superiors stared down with cracked, faded eyes, some faces smeared by time, others by something that looked eerily like burned soot. Eleanor caught a glimpse of one portrait with its face entirely scratched out, long gouges running from the canvas into the wood panel beneath. Their rooms were small and austere. Bare stone floors, narrow cots with horsehair mattresses, and crucifixes nailed unevenly above the door frames. The windows were small slits, barely large enough for moonlight to enter. The young women, now to be called sisters in training, were instructed to remain silent unless spoken to rise each morning at 5 for prayer, and to never, under any circumstances, wander the north wing. No reason was given, just a warning wrapped in scripture. For there are places where even angels fear to tread. The first week passed in unease. The convent's routines were strict and cold. Morning prayers in the unheated chapel, labor in the laundry and kitchens, afternoon scripture studies often recited aloud in Latin, even though many of the girls barely understood English. The meals were plain, watery broth, stale bread, bitter tea, and always eaten in silence under the watchful gaze of Mother Innocenta and 2 older nuns, Sister Agnes and Sister Miriam, whose expressions never changed, whose footsteps never made sound. At night, strange noises seeped through the convent walls, moaning, whispers, the rustle of heavy fabric dragging along stone floors. The girls dismissed it at first as old pipes or the creaks of settling stone. But Eleanor wasn't convinced. One night, she awoke to find her blankets soaked in cold water. Another time, she heard chanting coming from behind her wall, low and rhythmic like a dirge, in a language she couldn't place. She pressed her ear to the cold stone and whispered a prayer. The chanting stopped. It wasn't long before the dreams began. Each of the new sisters suffered from them, though none dared speak of it aloud until much later. Nightmares of blood dripping from the eyes of the Virgin Mary, of dark tunnels filled with weeping women, of a faceless nun whose mouth stretched wide open and screamed without sound. One girl, Sister Rachel, awoke clawing at her own face, shrieking that something had crawled inside her during the night. She was taken to the infirmary and not seen again. The next day, the sisters were told she had been sent to a distant convent in Missouri. It was the first disappearance. It would not be the last. As the days passed, the girls began to notice other oddities. The clocks in the convent never worked. They all froze at exactly 30:33 a.m. The chapel candles, no matter how many times lit, would always extinguish themselves at midnight. And the large wooden crucifix that hung above the altar, said to contain a sliver of Christ's original cross, was always damp, as if crying. One night, Eleanor, restless and shivering, crept out of bed and made her way down to the chapel, hoping for a moment of peace. The halls were darker than usual, the oil lamps extinguished, and an icy draft pressed against her skin like a hand. As she reached the chapel, she heard something that froze her blood. Sobbing. A woman sobbing, muffled and desperate, coming from behind the altar. Eleanor stepped forward, whispering hello, but the sound stopped instantly, as if whoever had been there knew they had been heard. Then a new sound emerged. A wet, rasping breath, followed by the gentle tap of footsteps, coming closer. Eleanor fled. She told no one. She would write about the incident only once, burying the entry deep in the center of her Bible. It wasn't human, she wrote. Whatever was in that chapel, it wore skin like a mask, but it wasn't one of us. By the second month, another girl, Sister Madeline, was gone. This time, they were told she had become too ill to continue service and had been sent back to her family. But Eleanor had overheard something. Two older nuns whispering by the laundry basin, one saying they found her by the north wing stairs, eyes open, lips black. The other made the sign of the cross and replied, "She saw the door." That's all it takes. The girls began to feel watched, not by the Mother Superior or even the silent Sister Agnes, but by the very walls themselves. Mirrors reflected shapes that weren't present. Doors that were locked one minute stood ajar the next. A girl named Isabel confessed that she found her rosary replaced one morning with a necklace made of teeth. Another claimed that her mattress had been filled with old hair, matted and still warm. But worst of all was the north wing, always locked, always cold. The door was made of thick ironwood, reinforced with rusted bands and sealed with a rosary nailed into its frame. Eleanor once dared to touch it. The moment her fingers brushed the surface, she heard something on the other side shift. Not walk, shift, as if something enormous was lying just beneath the stone and had awakened. She ran. One evening, during a particularly violent storm, the sisters were herded into the chapel early. Thunder cracked across the sky, illuminating the stained glass in flashes of red and blue. Rain pounded the roof like fists. As they knelt in prayer, the lights flickered, the crucifix above them tilted, and then all the candles went out at once. In the silence that followed, they heard it. A whisper, coming from every wall. "She is coming." The lights returned moments later, but in the pews, Sister Alice was gone. Another transfer, they were told. Only Eleanor noticed the deep gouges in the wooden floor where Alice had been sitting, scratch marks like fingernails dragging toward the shadows. By the end of that first winter, only 4 of the original 7 remained. Eleanor, Isabel, a timid girl named Margaret, and one who never gave her real name, only calling herself Sister Mercy. They were thinner, paler, quieter. Something had changed in them, something permanent. Their faith, once the foundation of their identity, had become something else. A shield, a weapon, a final defense against whatever darkness had seeped into their bones. One morning, Eleanor found a note on her pillow, handwritten, unsteady. It read, I saw her last night. She stood by my bed and smiled. Her face was not her own. That same day, Sister Mercy was gone. No one spoke her name again. And then the doctor arrived. They called themselves the Brides of Christ. That was the ancient vow, the sacred commitment, to abandon all earthly attachments and become one with the divine. For many of the young women who arrived at St. Mary's Convent between 1854 and 1862, this title meant hope, redemption, escape from a life of sin or suffering. For others, it meant isolation cloaked in holiness, a final retreat into the cold arms of God. But for some, for a very select few, it was something far more dangerous. For them, it was an invitation. By the spring of 1855, St. Mary's had welcomed more than 20 new initiates, each one chosen from far and wide, handpicked by bishops and clergy from families of good standing or grave misfortune. On the surface, the convent appeared to be a model of frontier virtue, offering structure and salvation in a lawless corner of Wisconsin. But beneath that facade, something unnatural had begun to fester. The sisters had no idea that the very title they had taken, Brides of Christ, was being twisted into something unrecognizable. The newcomers were young, many still in their teens. Their names now echo like prayers lost in a burning church. Sister Evelyn, from Pennsylvania, sent away after a scandal with a local priest. Sister Bernadette, born into a wealthy Boston family, exiled after refusing an arranged marriage. Sister Lucia, an orphan from the New York slums, who claimed to have heard angels speak when she slept. Each one had a reason to disappear from the world. Each one believed the convent would offer sanctuary. But from the moment they arrived, the holy ground beneath their feet offered no peace. Their training began immediately. Days were consumed with chants, fasting, scrubbing floors until their knuckles bled. Nights were spent in long, whispered prayers that stretched into the cold hours of the morning. They were forbidden to speak to each other except during brief afternoon sessions in the garden. Even then, their conversations were watched closely by the older sisters, three in particular, Sister Agnes, Sister Miriam, and a severe, bone-thin woman known only as Sister Catherine. Sister Catherine rarely spoke. When she did, it was always in Latin, always cryptic. Agnus non semper est innocens. The lamb is not always innocent. She roamed the halls after dark with a lantern that flickered blue instead of orange. The newer sisters soon began to dread the soft creak of her shoes against the stone floor. When she appeared outside your door, it meant someone had been chosen. Chosen, but for what? One evening, the novices gathered for evening scripture. The chapel was thick with candlelight, the stained glass glowing blood red in the setting sun. Mother Innocenta led the reading from Revelation. But halfway through the passage, Sister Bernadette fainted. Her body fell stiffly, her head striking the stone with a sickening crack. When they lifted her, her lips were blue and her hands ice cold. She awoke hours later screaming about fire and teeth. The next morning, she was gone. The girls were told she had taken ill and been returned to her family, but her belongings remained, her Bible still open to Psalm 88, her rosary beads arranged in a perfect spiral on the floor. Eleanor, who had grown increasingly skeptical since the disappearance of her roommate Sister Rachel, crept into the chapel late that night and found a fresh stain beneath the altar. It was still wet. It smelled of copper and salt. She was not the only one who noticed. A growing tension began to take root among the surviving sisters. Fear had a scent in those walls, stale sweat, dried incense, and something sour that no one could name. The older nuns became increasingly stern. Punishments for minor offenses, such as speaking out of turn or falling asleep during prayer, became harsher. Solitary confinement in the meditation chamber, water-only fast that lasted for days. At least one novice was caught trying to escape. Sister Eliza, who had only been at St. Mary's for 3 weeks, was dragged back inside by 2 nuns and never seen again. Soon after, a new rule was issued. No windows were to be opened after sunset. The girls asked why. The response was chilling. She walks when the light dies, and she listens. One night, as a storm thundered through the forest outside, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the convent. It came from the east wing, where the younger sisters were housed. The girls rushed from their cots, half-dressed and panicked, to find the source. At the end of the hallway, standing in front of Sister Lucia's door, was Sister Catherine, her hands folded, her face unreadable. Behind her, the door stood open. Inside, Lucia's bed was empty. Her mattress had been cut open. Her crucifix melted. No one spoke that night. By the following week, 3 more sisters were gone, and this time no explanations were given. It was around this time that Eleanor and 2 others, Margaret and Isa, began secretly documenting the events. They shared scraps of paper hidden in hollowed-out Bibles, encoded their messages using obscure references from the Book of Job. Eleanor described seeing strange figures moving through the courtyard at night, women in full habits, but walking with unnatural, jerking movements. Margaret wrote of finding teeth in her shoes one morning, small and human. Isabel claimed she heard a lullaby sung from behind the chapel wall, even though no one was inside. The 3 girls formed a pact. They would survive, no matter what it took. And then came the Ascension ceremony. It was a tradition, they were told, a sacred rite in which each sister in training would commit herself fully to her vows, sealed in a candlelit ceremony before the Virgin Mary. Eleanor was suspicious. Nothing about St. Mary's had ever resembled traditional Catholic rites, but attendance was mandatory. The ceremony took place in the chapel, transformed into something unrecognizable. All crucifixes had been covered in black veils. The stained glass windows were hidden behind thick red drapes. Candles burned with a strange green flame, filling the air with a cloying sweetness that made Eleanor dizzy. One by one, the sisters were led to the altar. There, in the presence of Mother Innocenta, Sister Catherine, and 2 unknown figures in red robes, each was made to recite vows in Latin. But it was not the usual vow of chastity, poverty, and obedience. This one invoked strange Astriel, keeper of the flame, and Mornatha, bride of the hollow tree. Eleanor recognized none of these from Scripture. When it was her turn, she feigned illness and collapsed before reaching the altar. She was carried out, her mind racing. What she saw as she was dragged down the hallway would haunt her forever. The veil had slipped from one of the red-robed figures, and beneath it, the face was wrong. The skin was tight and translucent, the eyes pitch black, the mouth a hole of teeth too many and too sharp. It had no nose, no ears, just smooth flesh and endless hunger. The next day, the girls were told they had all taken their vows. But Eleanor remembered nothing after fainting. Isabel wouldn't speak at all. Margaret wept until her throat bled. They had been married, they were told, not to Christ, not to the church, but to something older. The term Brides of Christ was no longer holy. It had been corrupted, twisted into a lie to mask the truth. These girls were offerings, sacrifices wrapped in white veils, vessels to be used, broken, and discarded. Soon, the strange pregnancies began. Sister Evelyn was the first. She began vomiting blood each morning, yet showed no signs of a child. Her abdomen swelled unnaturally fast. When the sisters touched her skin, it felt cold, clammy like damp stone. Her eyes turned milky white. And then, one night, she began to convulse. She screamed in tongues and bit through her own rosary. Mother Innocenta took her away in silence. The next morning, the room was clean. Not a drop of blood, not a strand of hair. But beneath the bed, Eleanor found a piece of skin, still warm. From there, it only grew worse. Whispers filled the halls, sometimes calling the girls by name. A shadow was seen moving across the ceiling, though nothing cast it. The older nuns stopped attending Mass entirely. Instead, they gathered each night in the locked north wing, carrying buckets of what looked like soil or ash. And once, Eleanor swore she saw Sister Catherine levitate during one of their gatherings, her mouth stretched open in a scream of joy that no human throat should ever make. One of the surviving girls, Sister Abigail, attempted escape. She made it to the edge of the woods. They found her body the next morning, nailed to the chapel door, upside down, her habit soaked in blood. The words Fidelis usque ad mortem, faithful until death, carved into her thighs. The church never intervened. The bishops who had once championed St. Mary's now refused to speak of it. Letters were ignored. Visitors turned away. Even local villagers were told to stay away, warned of a virulent illness inside the convent. But illness doesn't howl at night. It doesn't leave claw marks on the altar. It doesn't demand blood in exchange for silence. And still more disappeared. By 1862, only 3 girls remained from the original 23. Eleanor, Isabel, Margaret. They didn't speak anymore. They didn't sleep. They simply endured. Whatever was happening inside St. Mary's was no longer about salvation. It was a ritual, a cycle that had begun long before the convent was built, perhaps even before the first missionaries came to Wisconsin. Something had awakened beneath that sacred ground, something hungry, and the nuns, the ones who remained, were no longer servants of God. They were its brides. Not aloud, not directly, but at night, when the halls dimmed and the candles flickered low, every remaining girl at St. Mary's knew one thing without needing to say it. The walls were not silent. They hadn't been for months. Behind the stone, behind the mortar laid by tired Jesuit hands a decade earlier, something moved, something whispered, something waited. The sound wasn't constant. It came in waves, slow, chilling drips of noise that emerged after midnight, a murmur behind the plaster, a scrape that traveled from floor to ceiling, a soft, almost childlike sigh that echoed down corridors no one walked anymore. At first they had thought it was the wind, or mice, or the building settling. But the sounds grew, specific, rhythmic, purposeful. And worst of all, they grew familiar. The whispers began using their names. The first time Eleanor heard it, she was lying awake in her cot, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Sleep had become impossible since the Ascension ceremony. Every sound, every creak, every breath felt like it might be her last. She had taken to sleeping fully clothed, with her Bible clenched tight under her pillow and a rosary looped around both wrists. That night, as the candles in the hallway extinguished one by one, she heard it, clear as the final bell of Compline. Eleanor! A long hiss, barely more than a breath, yet somehow close. Too close. It didn't echo like a voice down a hallway. It came from within the wall itself, directly behind the stone headboard of her cot. She sat up. The whisper stopped. She pressed her palm against the wall. The stone was warm. Not room temperature. Warm. As if something had recently been breathing on the other side. She said nothing the next morning, but she didn't sleep again for days. The circles under her eyes deepened. Her hands trembled during prayer. At meals, she barely touched her food. The others noticed. But they were silent too, because they had heard it as well. The whispers had reached all of them. Margaret confessed first. She and Eleanor met in the garden during their 15-minute meditation recess, an increasingly rare gift from the now absent Sister Catherine. Margaret's voice was brittle, like a thread unraveling. It said my mother's name, she whispered. My mother's name. No one here knows it. I never told anyone. Eleanor simply nodded. She'd heard her father's voice 2 nights earlier, drifting from the stone next to the confessional. But he had died 6 years ago. Later that evening, Isabel cracked. They found her in the stairwell between the cloisters and the old infirmary, rocking back and forth with blood on her hands. She tried to dig through the wall, used a rusted iron spoon in her bare fingers. Beneath her nails were flakes of plaster and something darker. I can hear them, she cried. They're stuck. They're stuck behind the stone. They want out. They want inside us. Mother Innocenta had her removed by 2 veiled nuns, silent and faceless. Isabel never returned. Her room was sealed, the stone around her bed replaced, but Eleanor knew what she'd heard was real. The whispers weren't just hauntings. They were messages, invitations, warnings. One night, Eleanor remained behind after evening prayers. She claimed she was ill and asked to stay behind. Her request was granted without question. That alone alarmed her. They never said yes so easily. Once the others were gone, she tiptoed to the old storage room beside the sacristy. It had once been used for candle making, but had long since been abandoned, its floor sticky with wax and its walls yellow with rot. She waited, and the whispers returned. They rose slowly, like mist off a poisoned lake. Low murmurs, repeating phrases in Latin and older dialects she couldn't recognize. Some were prayers, some were moans, others were names. She pressed her ear to the wall and heard crying. A woman's voice, repeating the same phrase, "She's behind the altar, she's behind the altar." Then a knock, 3 knocks from inside the wall. Eleanor bolted. She fled to the chapel, breath ragged, sweat dripping down her back. But the chapel offered no comfort anymore. The once beautiful stained glass now looked stained with blood in moonlight. The crucifix above the altar leaned slightly to the left, as if trying to flee the ceiling. And the pews were cold, too cold. She sat anyway, and that's when she saw it. In the far corner of the chapel near the old confessional, the floor had buckled. A soft pile of dust and stones sat beneath a loose tile. Eleanor stepped forward, kneeling to inspect it. The stone was cracked. Underneath, a sliver of parchment, a letter, handwritten. Trembling, she unfolded it. If you find this, it's already too late for me. My name is Sister Anna. I came here in 1857 from New Orleans. I was one of 26. Now only 3 of us remain. The walls whisper because they remember. They are not made of stone. They are made of us. Do not believe what they tell you. The voice you hear is not God. They built the convent over something they could not understand. The priests knew. That's why they sealed the north wing. It's not a place. It's a wound in the world, and something bleeds through it. It takes the girls one by one. Then it learns them, speaks like them, prays like them, until we don't know who is who anymore. I buried Sister Ruth behind the altar after she turned. Her face was gone. Just smooth skin and teeth where her eyes should be. She screamed in my mother's voice. I don't know if I am still me. I don't know if writing this makes it real or makes it worse. But if you are reading this, run before your voice joins theirs. The parchment shook in her hands. She backed away slowly, heart pounding, head spinning. The whispers returned, louder now, sharper, intentional, her name again, but this time from all 4 walls. Eleanor, Eleanor, come see, behind the altar, come see. The sound didn't just exist in the walls anymore. It was in the air. She turned. The chapel was empty, but not silent. Now the crucifix was weeping. Thin streams of red poured from the eyes of the wooden Christ, soaking his face, dripping onto the altar cloth below. The air filled with the sickening sweet scent of decay masked in myrrh. Then the breathing began. Not her own. Another set, slow, ragged, right behind her. She spun around. No one. But the air was warm, wet, as if someone had just exhaled against her cheek. She ran from the chapel that night, not stopping until she reached the laundry room where Margaret was cleaning linens in silence. Eleanor collapsed in her arms, sobbing, clutching the parchment like a sacred relic. The next morning, the chapel was sealed. The Mother Superior declared it under restoration. The crucifix was removed. The altar covered in a black cloth. None of the younger sisters were allowed near, but Eleanor had seen enough. The walls were alive, and they were listening. She began to investigate further, now obsessed with understanding the voices. She stopped eating, stopped speaking during prayer. All her time was spent in the abandoned corridors, crouched beside the stone, listening. She began writing down everything she heard, the names, the phrases, the screams. Her journal filled with fragmented Latin and backward scripture, with diagrams of hidden staircases, with drawings of women with no faces. Each night, the whispers grew bolder. They no longer waited for darkness. By early April, Margaret had begun to hear them even during meals. Once she screamed aloud during breakfast, pointing at the wall. "She's in there! She's in there and she's wearing Abigail's skin!" The nuns dragged her away. Eleanor never saw her again. Only once, weeks later, she heard Margaret's voice, laughing coming from the kitchen walls. A brittle, too sharp laugh that echoed and repeated, like a recording trapped in an echo chamber. The final straw came when Eleanor found the hidden door. It was behind the old vestry, a room rarely entered anymore. Covered with shelves, broken candle molds, and dust-heavy curtains, it would have been easy to miss. But the whispers had led her there. They had changed their tone that week. They no longer begged. They commanded. Come see her. Come see the bride. She waits. She still wears her veil." Eleanor pushed aside a crumbling cabinet and found it. A door made of old blackened wood, smeared with wax and old blood, sealed not with a lock, but with rosary beads driven into the frame with nails. She pulled them free. Behind the door, a narrow spiral staircase descended into darkness. She lit a candle and descended. The stone was warm, the air stale, like it hadn't been breathed in over 100 years. The stairs twisted endlessly. With each step, the whispers grew louder, forming a chorus, moaning, crying, and chanting over each other, until they stopped suddenly. Eleanor reached the bottom. A small stone room greeted her, bare, except for a single chair. And in the chair, motionless, still in full habit, hands folded in her lap, head tilted down. Dead? No, she was Broly, mechanically. Eleanor stepped forward. The woman raised her head. Her face was smooth, skin stretched tight like wax. No eyes, no mouth, only teeth. Teeth where her cheeks should have been. The whisper returned inside Eleanor's head this time. She wore the habit long before Christ was born. Eleanor screamed, ran, climbed the stairs 2 at a time, sealed the door behind her, collapsed in her room, shaking, sobbing, clawing at her ears to make the voice stop. But it didn't. Now it was in her. That night, Eleanor heard the whispers once more. This time, they came from her own mouth. They said she was transferred to a mission in Dakota. But Sister Josephine's diary told a different story, one written in blood and silence. It began with Sister Josephine. Quiet, devout, always early for prayer, always the first to kneel, always with that thin smile that seemed born of sacrifice, not joy. The kind of woman who bore her pain like saints bore crosses, privately and without complaint. The others saw her as unshakable, until the morning she vanished. The explanation came quickly, too quickly. "She's been transferred," said Sister Agnes, her voice as cold and automatic as the chapel bells. "Called to a mission in Dakota. It was sudden, but her obedience was admirable. No farewell, no letters, no ceremony, just gone. But her bed was still warm, and beneath it her journal remained. It wasn't discovered by a nun, nor by the cleaning girls. Eleanor found it while looking for a rosary she thought had fallen from her cot. The journal was hidden between the floorboards under Sister Josephine's bed, wedged deep, as though someone had stuffed it there in a panic. When Eleanor opened it, the first pages were clean, filled with careful script and neat sketches of prayers and meditations. But the final page was different. The writing was uneven, rushed, the ink smeared, the words incomplete. There's something in the walls. I hear them walking even when the halls are empty. I see things, shapes reflected in the chapel glass, but when I turn, no one's there. Last night I woke up and saw the crucifix above my bed turning upside down by itself. I keep hearing someone breathing beneath the floor. I think I am being watched." Then a final line, half written before it trailed into a smear. "He has no eyes but sees everything." The rest was a blot of ink splashed with something darker. Dried blood, maybe. Eleanor wasn't sure. She didn't show anyone the journal. Not at first. Something told her it would disappear too. Within days, another girl was gone. Sister Abigail, gone after evening vespers. Her bed still made, her boots still lined up neatly, but her rosary beads had been placed on the pillow like a parting gift. Again, Sister Agnes explained it away. Called east to assist a cloister outside Boston. But her name never showed up in correspondence. Eleanor had begun keeping a secret ledger, cross-referencing the names of those transferred with any letters or updates from the outside. There were no records, not one letter, not one acknowledgement from the church that these women had arrived anywhere. That was when the others started whispering. It was no longer just about creaks in the walls or strange dreams. They spoke of voices, of shadows moving on their own, of mirrors fogging from breath even when the air was still. One girl, Sister Eliza, claimed she woke up to find her veil laid across her face like a burial shroud. Another swore she saw Sister Josephine standing at the far end of the corridor the night after she disappeared, barefoot, eyes sewn shut, mouth open in a silent scream. Mother Innocenta didn't respond to these fears. She grew more reclusive. Her sermons became cryptic, spoken in fragments of Latin. She spoke of obedience and silence as virtues above all. "The noise of the world is the devil's breath," she'd whisper during confession, "and silence is the fortress of God." But the silence at St. Mary's had begun to rot. The walls were keeping secrets, and the girls were disappearing one by one. No longer was there a sense of security in numbers. Every few nights, someone failed to rise for morning prayer. Sister Catherine would simply mark the name from the roll and carry on. Those who asked questions were reprimanded, given extra penance, denied meals, isolated. Eleanor saw Sister Ruth scrubbing the stone floor near the north wing for 12 hours straight, hands raw, lips bleeding from whispered Hail Marys. Her sin? Asking where Sister Abigail had gone. By the time the 6th girl vanished, even the older nuns stopped asking questions. A fog of fear settled in the halls. Mass was quieter, meals were shorter, doors were locked earlier. And no one looked into mirrors anymore. Not after Sister Helena reportedly screamed herself hoarse at her own reflection. claiming something inside it had smiled at her with too many teeth. Then came the bell. It was the dead of night, well past midnight, when the chapel bell rang out. Not the usual 3 or 4 chimes for nocturnal prayer, but 13 deep tolls, each one slower and heavier than the last. The sound echoed through the convent like the heartbeat of something buried beneath it. No one spoke of it the next day. But Eleanor counted her sisters at breakfast. There were only 15 left, from over 30, and yet the ledgers still listed 32. No one had been officially transferred for 3 weeks. That's when Eleanor made the decision to start recording everything. She stayed awake at night, documenting sounds, the shuffling steps behind walls, the whispers that sometimes called her name. Once, she heard a knocking from beneath her cot. 3 sharp knocks like a ritual. She didn't answer. But in the morning, her pillow was soaked through and a feather was stuck to her cheek, one from a bird not native to Wisconsin. She began collecting the belongings of the vanished. A worn shoe, a torn page from a prayer book, a locket with a faded daguerreotype. And she kept Sister Josephine's journal close, now adding her own notes to the back. The entries read like confessions, like last words. She feared one day her writing might end the same way, mid-sentence, trailing off in blood and fear. Then came the moment she couldn't ignore. Sister Beatrice, one of the older, more stoic nuns, approached her at dusk. They met beside the old garden fountain, which had long since dried up and cracked. Beatrice's face was pale, eyes sunken, hands trembling as she held something out to Eleanor. A torn piece of habit cloth, stained dark, with a single embroidered cross still intact. "It's hers," Beatrice whispered. "Josephine's. I found it behind the panel in the east wing. There's blood behind the wall, a lot of it." Eleanor took the cloth. When she looked up, Beatrice was already walking away. That night, the east wing was sealed with bricks. By dawn, Sister Beatrice was gone. No one ever saw her again, and the pattern was now undeniable. The girls weren't leaving. They were being taken. By what or by whom remained a mystery, but one thing was certain. St. Mary's was bleeding from the inside, and no prayer could stop it now. The first snow of winter had come early that year, dusting the rooftops and dead trees of the convent with a cold, sterile silence. The sisters were forbidden from speaking of omens, but even Mother Innocenta's stiff posture and trembling hands suggested unease. The hearths burned lower. The chapel candles flickered out more often, and then he arrived. There was no warning, no message, no clerical letter, just the sudden creak of the front door opening against the bitter wind. And there he was, gaunt man in a coat the color of coal, his boots untouched by the snow he had supposedly walked through. His hair was slicked neatly back, unnaturally dark, and his face was thin with lips nearly colorless. But it was his eyes that turned the air to frost in Eleanor's chest. They were pale, not gray or blue, but nearly translucent, like the cloudy film that coats the eyes of the dead. They did not blocus, and yet they saw everything. He carried no papers, no crucifix, no holy greeting, only a small black bag and an expression carved from stone. Mother Innocenta received him at the threshold with a nod, not a word, and led him through the main corridor. Eleanor, hiding in the shadows near the stairwell, saw it all. The Mother Superior bowed slightly as they passed the reliquary. She never bowed to anyone. The nuns were told the next morning that a physician had arrived to assist in the care of the sisters for their physical and spiritual well-being. No further explanation was given. Questions were discouraged, but Eleanor noticed how the older nuns kept their heads lowered when his name was mentioned. He was never referred to as a doctor. He was always the physician. He took over the East Infirmary within hours. The East Infirmary had not been used in over a year, not since Sister Catherine fell ill and died coughing blood into her own habit. Since then, the hall had been sealed, the door chained shut, the windows boarded up. Yet somehow by evening, the corridor lights glowed again. The doors were unchained. Inside, firelight flickered beneath the cracks. But it wasn't the color of fire. It was blue. The sisters began disappearing more rapidly after his arrival. One by one, they were called to the infirmary, their names whispered during vespers or written on scraps of parchment slid under their cell doors. The first was Sister Rachel, 17, Kind, nervous, always humming old Latin hymns while feeding the sparrows outside. She went to the East Infirmary before dawn. She was never seen again. "She's been transferred," said Mother Innocenta the following morning. "A mission in Duluth." But Eleanor found Rachel's crucifix hidden behind a loose stone in the dormitory wall. It was broken, the Christ figure twisted at the neck. The silver was stained dark with something that wasn't rust. Then Sister Colette, then Ruth, then Theodora. Always the same explanation, always the same silence. One evening, Eleanor stayed awake and crept toward the infirmary door. Through the frosted glass, she saw the physician standing over Sister Naomi, who lay limp on the examination table. Eleanor could not see Naomi's face, only her bare feet hanging just off the edge. The physician moved slowly, precisely, like a man painting a canvas. On the tray beside him were tools, none of them familiar. They glistened with something wet and dark. He raised one long silver instrument, thin as a knitting needle, and lowered it toward Naomi's forehead. Eleanor stumbled backward, suppressing a scream. She fled to her room and locked the door. The next morning, Sister Naomi sat in the chapel pew, staring blankly at the altar. She did not blink. When Eleanor sat beside her and whispered her name, Naomi slowly turned and smiled. A crooked, hollow smile, her teeth stained and gums raw. Her eyes were glassy and unfocused, as though she was seeing something far beyond the chapel walls. She had been changed. More sisters returned this way, bodies intact but souls absent. They did not speak, they did not pray, they did not cry. One by one, they became ghosts of themselves. Margaret began keeping a record in her missal, times, names, moon phases. She noticed something Eleanor had suspected. Each disappearance happened during the waning crescent. Each girl called to the infirmary had reported strange dreams the night before. Dreams of water running upward, of crucifixes melting into ash, of chanting voices beneath the chapel floor. And each one had seen the physician in their dreams before they ever saw him in the flesh. He had been waiting for them. Eleanor resolved to learn the truth. She broke into the east wing with Margaret one night after matins. They pried open a window and climbed inside. The hallway smelled of medicine, sulfur, and something else, something metallic and old. The door to the infirmary was ajar. Inside were shelves filled with glass jars. Some held yellowed organs suspended in fluid. Others contained hair, bone, and in one case a human tongue, shriveled and floating like seaweed. The walls were covered in notes, sketches of human bodies overlaid with impossible geometry, spiral diagrams labeled in Latin and something older. One line was repeated on multiple pages: Bride of Silence, Vessel of Return. At the back of the room sat a cabinet, locked and chained. On it, a leather-bound book lay open. It was the physician's journal. They flipped through the pages with trembling fingers. Each girl had a page, a diagram, a procedure. Subject 9, reopened spine, ligaments replaced with silver filament, responsive to lunar cycles, host compliant. Subject 14, veil accepted, language memory erased, sight replaced with inner vision, dream pattern active. Subject 21, unusable, expired during phase alignment, heart extracted and preserved. Eleanor's name was at the bottom of the final page. No notes yet, just a single word beneath it. Ready. They fled that night, but the damage was done. By the next morning, Margaret was gone. Her bed undisturbed, her journal burned, her name crossed off the prayer list. Eleanor knew she was alone now. She began writing her own account in secret, hiding pages beneath the chapel floorboards. She did not sleep. She did not eat much. She heard voices in the walls calling her name. She smelled smoke when no candles were lit. Once she woke to find lilies on her pillow, the same scent she had caught on the physician's coat. She no longer prayed to be rescued. She prayed to be remembered. The night before she expected to be summoned, Eleanor crept once more to the East Infirmary. It was empty. The jars were gone. The diagrams burned. Only the examination table remained. And the physician. He stood at the window, staring into the falling snow, as though expecting her. "You're brave," he said, voice neither deep nor high, but oddly hollow. "They always are at first, but the body yields." She didn't speak. He turned. "You know what we're doing, don't you?" She nodded. "You see it now. You've seen them, the others, beyond the veil." He stepped closer. She could hear a faint ticking inside him like a watch without a case. They volunteered. They were chosen. "No," Eleanor whispered. "They were taken." The physician smiled. There is no difference. In the end, they all kneel. He reached for her, but Eleanor turned and ran. Behind her, the lights in the hallway began to stutter. The walls groaned. The floor bent. She didn't stop. She ran until her legs failed her, collapsing in the chapel beside the altar. She sobbed for the first time in months. Not out of fear, but rage. And when she looked up, she saw the crucifix above the altar had begun to bleed. The north wing was never spoken of. Not in confession, not during supper, not even in the whispers that haunted the dormitories after midnight. It was a forbidden place. Even the Mother Superior referred to it only once in passing as the silent quarter. No one was allowed near it. Its doors were sealed with iron, its windows covered with soot-blackened cloth, and the hallway leading to it had been cordoned off with heavy red drapery, like a theater curtain hiding a scene too gruesome to bear. But Eleanor had always known it held the answers. And now, with Margaret gone and the physician watching her every movement, she was ready to open the one door no one dared approach. The wing had been sealed for as long as Eleanor had been at St. Mary's. Some said it was once a dormitory for the sick and mentally unfit nuns, those who had gone mad with fasting and visions, or who had claimed to hear voices from the crucifix. Others whispered it had once been a birthing chamber, a secret kept for the girls sent there pregnant, far from the judgment of their towns or parishes. But Eleanor had read too much, seen too much, lost too many friends to believe those were the only truths. It was Sister Agatha who'd once slipped and mentioned it, not in words, but in a glance. Eleanor had been delivering fresh linens to the lower floor when a thunderstorm rattled the shutters. The hallway lights flickered, and a gust of wind blew open the heavy red curtain that cloaked the entrance to the north wing. Eleanor had frozen in her tracks. The door beneath it was unlike the others, taller, darker, rimmed in rusted chains, and marked with deep grooves that looked disturbingly like claw marks. Sister Agatha, standing just behind her, dropped her basin of holy water and muttered, "Not again." Eleanor never forgot the way her voice broke, and now she stood once more at the edge of the red curtain, alone. The rest of the convent was sleeping, or pretending to. The physician had left that morning to attend a burial in the forest, though no funeral had been announced and no bell had rung. Eleanor took her chance. She clutched a candle in her left hand, her heart in the right, and slowly she pulled back the curtain. The air changed immediately. The hallway behind the curtain was colder. The walls were stained with moisture that had eaten away at the plaster. The stone beneath her feet felt uneven, as though it were shifting ever so slightly with each step. The door to the north wing loomed in front of her, chained shut with 3 thick iron bands, each etched with ancient script that seemed to shimmer in the candlelight. At the center was a crucifix, but unlike the others in the convent, this one was twisted, Christ's arms curved upward, as though in agony rather than surrender. Eleanor reached into her pocket and pulled out the stolen key. She had found it sewn into the lining of Sister Josephine's diary weeks ago, hidden behind the final bloody page. Its teeth were long and cruel, and it smelled faintly of sulfur. It fit perfectly into the lock. The chains fell one by one, each with a groan like a dying animal. The door creaked open, not fast, not dramatically, but with a reluctant hiss like the building itself didn't want her to enter. Inside, the hallway was silent. Not empty, silent! The kind of silence that eats sound, that swallows your breath and heartbeat. Eleanor stepped inside. The north wing smelled of rot and candle wax. Old decay lingered in the walls. The floor was lined with worn wooden planks, but some had buckled with moisture. Cobwebs clung to the ceiling like lace woven by mad hands. And the doors were all shut tight, each one bearing a single Roman numeral carved deep into the wood. 3, all the way to 13. 13 rooms. 13 brides? She moved past the first door, locked, the second, locked, the third. She pushed it open. Inside was a small room, barely lit. Dust danced in the air. In the center sat a single bed, nailed to the floor, and an iron chair in the corner facing it. A Bible lay open on the blanket, but its pages had been burned, words scalded black as though they'd been cursed. On the walls, scripture had been written in red ink, or blood. The bride shall bleed, the womb shall open, the silent shall scream. Eleanor backed out. Room 4 was the same. Room 5 had chains hanging from the ceiling. Room for 6 was worse. It contained a statue of the Virgin Mary, life-size, cracked and covered in scratches. Her face had been sanded off. Where her eyes once were, someone had gouged 2 holes the size of fists. Beneath the statue, dozens of prayer cards lay torn and charred, and scrawled on the wall behind her, "She doesn't see you, she sees through you." Eleanor pressed on. By the time she reached room 9, her candle had nearly burned out. But room 9 was open, and it wasn't empty. The bed was made. The floor was clean. A faint melody played from somewhere unseen, a music box tune, distant and broken. On the chair sat a habit, freshly pressed, her size. And above it, pinned to the wall with a rusted dagger, was a note in Sister Margaret's handwriting. "They chose you because you're the last one who remembers. Leave now or you'll become the 13th. Behind her, the door slammed shut. She screamed. The candle went out. Darkness enveloped everything. But in the dark, she heard movement. Footsteps, soft, bare, and then breathing. Not from one person, but from many. She pressed herself against the wall, gasping silently. A voice whispered near her ear, "You found us." Then a dozen voices in chorus. "We never left." The forbidden journal. The journal was not meant to be found. That much was certain from the moment Eleanor touched it. The leather cover was warm, unnaturally so, as if it had absorbed the final breaths of every hand that had dared open it. Bound in animal hide, cracked and scorched at the edges, it was stitched with a thread that did not feel like thread at all. It was coarse, reddish, and Eleanor had the disturbing sense that it might once have been hair. Human, perhaps, or something worse. She had discovered it hidden inside the altar of the crypt beneath St. Mary's, the oldest, most forsaken part of the convent. Few knew it even existed. The main chapel had long replaced the crumbling underground shrine, yet Eleanor had often escaped there to weep, to think, to pray, when she still believed prayer had power. But tonight was different. Tonight, after the horrors she had witnessed in the north wing, the claw marks, the chanting, the chilling voice that whispered, "We never left," she needed answers, real answers. The altar was just stone, unmarked, unassuming. But as she knelt beside it, her hand brushed a hidden groove, something not quite natural. She followed it, fingers trembling, and pressed against a concealed notch. With a dry, reluctant groan, the stone slab shifted. Beneath it, a shallow hollow wrapped in layers of moldy cloth and wax paper. And at its heart, the journal. It bore no title, no author's name, no indication of when it had been written. Just a single line burned into the inside cover. "To the last bride of silence, you are not alone." The first few pages were written in ink so faded it was barely legible. Cursive, tight, frantic in places. Eleanor turned to a page where the handwriting became clearer, dated 1839. "They said we came to pray. They lied. We were sent to prepare." The writer spoke of rituals, of dreams not their own, of being taught to suppress all sensation, hunger, pain, even compassion, so that their bodies could become vessels for the listening. What they were listening for was never explained, not at first, but the implication was clear. The convent had been built not as a sanctuary, but as a gate. Eleanor read for hours, tucked in the shadows, candle low, breath shallow. Each page pulled her deeper into a truth that curdled her blood. The first one didn't scream or shout. She opened her mouth and sang, but it wasn't a hymn, it was older. The sound shook the stones. The physician was here then too, but he was called by another name. He does not age, he does not belong to time. Eleanor's heart pounded. The same figure, the same hollow eyes. The man who had arrived without carriage, whose presence chilled the breath in her lungs, had been there decades ago, possibly longer. One entry dated 1842 was circled in black ink. Mother Miriam said the silence is not absence, it is waiting. The walls are pregnant with it. The floors bleed it. When we fast, when we cut ourselves, it grows stronger. She said soon it would speak. As Eleanor turned to the next page, something tumbled out. A torn photograph, the edges brittle, the image barely visible. 4 young women, dressed in habits, standing beneath what looked like the old garden arbor, smiles carved onto faces that didn't quite reach their eyes. On the back, written in a childlike hand, "We were chosen, we didn't want to be." Eleanor recognized one of the faces, Margaret, not as she looked last week, but younger, much younger. The journal spoke of 13, always 13. 13 brides prepared every decade, 13 to be transformed, silenced, and offered. Some survived, most did not. The rituals had changed over time, refined by the physician and his order, those cloaked figures who came under different names, monks, exorcists, even priests. But they were none of those things. They were midwives for something beneath. The earth drinks them, one passage read. It feeds on their marrow, their silence, their obedience. The womb beneath must be satisfied. Eleanor felt sick. There was no mission in Dakota, no service in Boston, no retreat in Duluth. They were lies. Every last one. The sisters were not transferred. They were taken, bled, hollowed, rewritten. One entry, shakier than the rest, described the fate of a nun who resisted. Sister Amara tried to run. They caught her at the edge of the woods. I saw them drag her back, her mouth stuffed with lilies, her eyes torn open. They made us watch as she was taken to the chamber. They said she would be the veil breaker, but her mind shattered. She sang for 3 days straight. On the 4th day, her voice stopped, but her mouth stayed open. They said she was ready. As Eleanor read, she felt the walls around her grow tighter, as though the crypt itself was leaning closer to listen. She turned the page and stopped. The next entry had no date, no preamble, just a name written in perfect, chilling script. Eleanor H., to be prepared by Advent, full compliance expected. The entry continued in a new hand, familiar, the same hand she had seen in the physician's diagrams. Subject displays elevated sensitivity, recurrent dreams, psychic bleed-through, resistance to hymn silencing, may require secondary intervention. Possibility, final gatekeeper, her name, in this cursed book, long before she ever found it, long before she had arrived. She was always meant to find it. She was never meant to survive. A sudden gust extinguished her candle. The crypt plunged into darkness. For a long moment, there was only the sound of her heartbeat, loud as thunder in her ears. Then from the black, a low hum began to build, not mechanical, not musical, organic, wet, like a throat vibrating just behind the wall. Then a whisper, bride. Eleanor slammed the journal shut. She stumbled through the dark, hands scraping stone, until she reached the stairwell and burst into the open night air. The snow had stopped falling, but the clouds hung low, swollen and bruised. The convent loomed behind her like a mausoleum. She clutched the journal to her chest. It was alive. She could feel it now, its pulse, faint but steady. It was a record, a prophecy, a trap, and it was unfinished. Back in her cell, she wrapped it in linen and stashed it beneath the loose floorboard beneath her bed. She didn't sleep. Instead, she sat staring at the crucifix on the wall, her mind racing. If she was meant to be the 13th, if she was the final offering, then she had only days, maybe hours. But what if she could end it? The journal spoke often of a veil, a gate, a birth yet to come. What if the rituals weren't yet complete? What if stopping the last one, her, could collapse the entire process? But then, what of the others? Were they beyond saving? One passage had mentioned something. The ritual is reversible only if the 13th remains whole. If she speaks, the silence dies. If she screams, the womb cannot open. Eleanor clenched her jaw. She had been silent for too long. If her scream could kill the womb, if her voice could end this madness, then she would make herself heard. She would become their heretic, their poison, their end. She looked at the journal one last time, then began writing her own chapter.